Hi, my name is Zachary Ono. So today I'm going to talk about the fair information practice principles. That is the FIPPs. Then understanding the FIPPs, there are eight guidelines under fair information practice principle, the FIPPs, that determine the way organizations and particularly the government agencies handle personal data. The principle of transparency implies that organization is obliged to inform about the information uh, being collected and why by means of public notice or privacy impact assessment. Individual participation principle involves giving individuals an opportunity to participate in the process of using their personal data through such activities as consenting, accessing records, and requesting corrections. Purpose specific, specification principle assume that the organization to specify its authority and the reason for collecting information prior to doing this. The principle of data minimization assumes limiting the amount of information collected and the duration of storage to the minimum possible. Use limitation is the idea that information can be used solely for the purpose of its initial gathering. Then data quality and integrity is a principle that implies the maintenance of information accuracy and completeness. The principle of security implies protection of information from all kinds of losses or theft. And finally, the principle of accountability auditing is about providing worse adherence to these principles by conducting regular audits and trainings. So how the FIPPs compare to other privacy laws and regulations. Moreover, the FIPPs are not unique to any single legislation. They constitute the core of most contemporary privacy regulations. Indeed, the 1973 report of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare provided the basis for the Privacy Act of 1974, which is the primary legislation regulating the handling of personal records by the federal agencies. The very similar principles of privacy protection can be found abroad. Thus, the European Union General Data Protection Regulation or the GDPR contains such principles as purpose limitations, data minimization, accuracy, and accountability. They correspond to the FIPPs almost completely, but are called in a different way. Another example is the principles developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1981, which were used as a basis for privacy legislation across countries as Canada and Panama. Finally, even in the US, such secretarial privacy legislation as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, the HIPAA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, are based on the FIPPs as well. Thus, despite differences in their terminology, all these frameworks use the language of the FIPPs to express themselves. So how the FIPPs protect PII and how a federal agency applies them. The FIPPs work to ensure the protection of PII through the incorporation of privacy requirements as every step of an agency's operations, instead of simply tackling them on at the end. As an example, we all consider the Department of Homeland Security the first government agency required by law to have a privacy office. For transparency, the DHS releases privacy impact assessment and system of records notices so that the general public can know what kinds of data they are collecting and for what reason. So the DHS facilitates individual participation through programs such as the DH Travel Readiness Inquiry Program, allow people to challenge or change information that might have been used against them, such as if they were put aside for additional screening. Purpose specification and data minimization can both be seen when the DHS describes each of its data collection, associating them to one of their legally defined authorities and avoiding the collection of items such as social security numbers where possible. The use limitation is achieved through stringent need to know policies as well as consent prior to any data transfer. DHS maintains data quality through direct information collection from individuals where possible, and the availability of correction options. Security is integrated through the mandatory system certification based on the sensitivity of the data involved. Finally, accountability is achieved through the oversight of the agency chief privacy officer, inspector general reviews, and audits confirming that practices follows policies. That is the end of my topic today. Thank you for listening.